Hello and welcome to The Rest is Classified. I'm Gordon Corera.
And I'm David McCloskey.
This is a special emergency pod. We're breaking already our regular schedule. We've only been going 2 weeks and we're already shaking things up slightly because we thought it was important to bring you an emergency pod, a special pod, looking at those really amazing events in Syria in the last few days. We're recording this on the evening of Monday, 9th of December, because we just felt that there was some things we had to convey and we wanted to talk about, not in our normal format of telling a story, but more of a discussion between me and David, because David has, as we'll hear, some real first-hand experience in Syria. So just to recap where we are, the Assad family had been in power in Syria for, I guess, more than half a century, ruling that country with what seemed like an iron grip. Then 2011, the time of that Arab Spring, protests broke out against their hold on power, leading to a civil war, chemical weapons used by the regime against their own people. The West didn't intervene after that, but Russia did to prop up the Assad regime. And it looked, David, didn't it, like it was frozen and nothing was changing until, this really remarkable set of events, which started on November the 27th, incidentally, the day we launched our new podcast, although I don't think there's any link between those two things, when this...
Butterfly effect, Gordon. Butterfly effect.
When this coalition of opposition groups led by Leila Al-Shami began a march. And, in a matter of days, had taken city after city, and eventually on the weekend took Damascus, and President Assad fell from power and flew, his statues ripped down. David, as someone who'd spent time in Damascus, how did it feel watching that?
I felt two emotions that I guess at the time I wondered if they were mutually exclusive. I don't think they are. The first one was just joy, I think, at watching a regime that is murderous, psychopathic, exceedingly brutal, violent, enter sort of the dustbin of history. And to see Assad turn tail and run was very satisfying. As somebody who has watched this guy for a lot of his professional life and studied him for almost a decade at CIA. So there was a tremendous amount of joy in that just moment. There was also, I think, joy in seeing that, and I think as we get into this conversation, Gordon, we'll talk about this group more, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which is sort of one of the primary rebel groups or opposition groups to Assad that has governed a big patch of the northwestern part of Syria for most of the past decade. And that really kind of spearheaded this assault, although there were plenty of other factions involved, which we can talk about at due time. But in kind of watching this, I felt some joy in the fact that the people who overthrew Assad were not some constellation of foreign powers, but Syrians, and that Syrians will now have a chance to build a better Syria. So real joy in those two dynamics.
And there have been extraordinary images and stories on social media in the last couple of days as well, David, of the prisons being kind of opened up and people being liberated. And some prisoners, I think, who'd been in there, it sounds like, for decades, and now being released as the regime falls.
I think the social media coverage of this, and look, we can talk all day about sort of the ills of social media, but in these kind of incidences, right? It's actually really fascinating what can come to the fore immediately. And you have, I think, this interesting, really sad dichotomy about the sort of autocracy of Bashar al-Assad, right? Because on the one hand, you have these horrendous videos of these prisons. And Gordon, there's probably still almost 100,000 people in this kind of prison system that are unaccounted for, right? And many of whom,
who might be dead or might be,
right, and who have been kind of forcibly disappeared into these, just dungeons. And the reality of some of these people who are being brought up is like, the first time they're going to see a smartphone is the person taking the video, right?
Because they've been in there for so long.
They've been in there for so long. There were accounts of prisoners who thought that Hafez al-Assad, who was Bashar's father, was still in power. So you have these just, there's this gut wrenching, this kind of, really the sadism of the regime on full display. And then on the other side, you have these insane videos of kind of almost like the, I guess, fallen dictator porn of, a massive house with, weirdly enough, the houses are like, there's like no furniture. I don't know why. It was the same in Saddam's palaces. I don't know why do the dictators take the furniture with them? I'm not exactly sure.
Or do people loot it? I don't know.
There's a massive fleet of, luxury vehicles. There's pools. I think when Yanukovych, the Ukrainian, I guess, autocrat, fled in 2014, there was like an ostrich zoo. I don't think we found an ostrich zoo in Syria yet. But, it's just kind of, I think those two, kind of the luxury of Assad at the top, and then just the depravity of these prison systems is.
Yeah. There was some person who'd been imprisoned, I think in the 80s, aged 18, finally reuniting with his family. So it's really emotional, I think, to see those scenes.
I would also be remiss if I didn't say that I felt some amount of fear in that, there will probably be more chaos to come. And, it is so rarely the case in this region that things, at least it hasn't been the case recently, that things get better. And so you really hope that we're going to be proved wrong here. But I do feel a real sense of fear at what's coming next and how, sort of a better Syria can be reconstituted. But I think it's just really important to stress that it is hard, I think, at this point to imagine a more odious, repressive structure than Bashar al-Assad's regime taking root in Syria, at least over the near to medium term.
Well, let's talk about that a bit, because, you were there in Syria, I guess, before the civil war. Tell us a little bit about what your role was, as far as you can, given it was for the CIA.
Yeah, so I was a CIA analyst. I worked on Syria. I started working on Syria in 2006 and worked on it all the way up until the day I left Langley. And I was working in Damascus in time prior to the outbreak of the civil war. I was an analyst in the CIA's station in Damascus, just, an office in the embassy, which got, I believe, shuttered in 2012. We eventually closed our embassy there. And I actually had the opportunity to be there as some of these other uprisings in the region began, in Tunisia in late 2010, and then in Egypt in early 2011. And most of what my job was there was actually pretty similar to what an analyst would do at Langley, which is, you're sort of watching all of these disparate sources of information that we're collecting to build a picture of, what's going on in Syria, and being able to answer very specific questions for our chief of station, the ambassador, broader sort of U.S. policymakers on Syria. And it has struck me over the past few weeks that many of the questions that I would have been answering as the sort of Arab Spring initially broke out in 2011 are very similar to the bigger questions that analysts are probably needing to answer today. Big questions around the nature of the opposition. It's not even opposition anymore, I guess. The nature of the interim government. It's so hard for me to even get out of that old verbiage, how cohesive it is, how capable it is, what is going to happen to elements of the regime that are still out there and its militias. All kinds of really huge questions that these analysts are doubtless working on today.
And just to go back a bit to your time there, did you feel, though, the sense of, a security service from the Syrian side watching the embassy? Did you feel that they had a kind of iron grip on the country? Because I think that was the sense people had before 2011, which was that this was a pretty tough dictatorship, which had used real violence to keep control of that country and was willing to do it. Did you have that sense that this was a family, the Assad family, willing to do whatever it took to hold on to power at that time?
Well, I'll tell you, as an American working at the embassy in Damascus, you're going to experience surveillance. And I would say that, it was not, it was almost more comedic than anything, right? You had guys in, sort of government black cars that would follow you around, and they wore, poorly tailored polyester suits and white gym socks. And, they were just sort of keeping an eye on you. And honestly, as an analyst there, like, it didn't bother me all that much, because it actually made you feel like, well, if someone tried to rob me or carjack me or something, like, these guys are going to stop that, because they don't want that to happen to, an American diplomat on their soil. I mean, Syria is the kind of place where, they break into your hotel room and, send you these sort of signals that they could do what they wanted. And, I will be very curious if at some point some of these archives get opened, what the profile on young David McCloskey, some poor analyst in some piece of Syria's, security services had to write up, or the boring surveillance reports of following me around.
Already photos of you, perhaps?
Yeah, exactly.
Some surveillance photos of the young David McCloskey, which might exist somewhere in the archives. Who knows who's getting hold of those now? I mean, it is always a big thing, isn't it? When a regime falls, one of the first things people go for is who's going to secure the security service files, because that's where the secrets are.
There were, I think there was a big fire at the sort of one of these, an immigration and passport office in Damascus, which, made me think initially of, someone's burning files. I mean, if you see some of these photos of that have come out now inside Syrian security services, inside their offices, I mean, they are full of files, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that is going to be there. It definitely would not have been on my 2024 sort of holiday bingo card to have nude videos of me in my hotel room come out, leaked by the Syrian security services in the aftermath of the fall of the Assad regime. But, it's been a strange year anyway. So
it is an unpredictable year. But I guess what that tells you is, all those files, is that they did have a tight grip on the country, it seemed.
They did.
They really were, they were a pretty effective police state, willing to use ruthless violence, as they did after 2011, which I guess, makes it surprising in a sense that then things have moved so fast now, and that they've, effectively run and fled and collapsed so quickly.
It's probably worth a little bit on the Assad regime of pre-Civil War, and what that looked like, how it sustained power, and then comparing that to the Assad regime of late 2024, because we will see that there are this regime has changed and morphed massively in the almost 15 years. And the changes are, I think, the reason it's gone, right? Or one of them. So the Assad regime of, sort of pre-Arab Spring, there's 4 principal security services, spy services. They've got wonderfully horrible sort of, Stalinist names: the Political Security Directorate, they have Air Force Intelligence, they've got the General Intelligence Directorate, they've got Syrian Military Intelligence. They're sort of a constellation of other smaller groups inside different organs of the state. It was primarily about maintaining control in Syria. Assad had a number of elite military units they used as sort of a Praetorian Guard. There's a long history of coups in Damascus. And so you have this structure that operated on what we called kind of a hub and spoke model, which was all of these different groups actually in different security services spied on each other. And oftentimes the regime would move people around inside the services. So you'd have like the deputy chief of the General Intelligence Directorate might actually have a direct line to Bashar al-Assad when the chief doesn't. And the whole point of the deputy being there is to keep tabs on the organization. Right. They move people around constantly. There are official instruments of state security, and it is a highly centralized system, even though there are, multiple actors. You fast forward to what has happened to Syria's repressive apparatus, really, over the course of the past almost 15 years. And because Assad had to essentially become a Iranian and Russian vassal in order to stay in power, you had a proliferation of militias, military groups that were not really under his control. And you had a whole system of kind of black market trading and war profiteering that had been stood up to essentially keep the place going in these really trying years of the war. And so what you ended up with, and this is a gross oversimplification, but what you had happen, Gordon, was very similarly, I think, to the way the Iraqi army in 2014 essentially was just, vaporized or melted away, rather, when the Islamic State started to
and they just disappeared.
On mostly just disappeared. You had a Syrian army and, sort of a repressive apparatus that had become totally hollowed out, riven with corruption, riven with sectarianism, totally, lacking morale or any purpose of fighting. And it was a paper tiger. And so you have these maps of Syria from, a month ago that show where Assad is in control, quote unquote. And it's total garbage. He has a garrison there. He's got, poorly paid conscripts, or even if they're paid at all, who are stationing, different posts and military bases and all this. And it was nothing. He could not use any of that anymore to attack Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, to sort of resist this push that they made out of Idlib, down into Aleppo, and finally to Damascus.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, this idea. As you say, it was hollowed out. I mean, I was reading a fascinating piece about the drug trade that comes out of Syria, Captagon, which is this drug which is widely used in the Middle East. And you realize that the kind of drug trade and criminality had become intertwined with the upper reaches of the regime, and kind of criminal groups were, if you like, using the regime to make money. And there are these kind of mafia-like kind of arrangements at the top level. And you realize, none of these people really cared about the state or the Assad family anymore. They were in it for themselves. And so, you're right. All it took then was this kind of one push for it all to fall over and to kind of topple in an amazing speed. I mean, even with that, context, it still feels remarkable how fast it collapsed. I mean, you kept on thinking, well, when they get to Damascus, then, the last, Praetorian Guard, will put up a fight and stop it. And yet, even at that point, it didn't seem like there was anyone there willing to fight for them.
That is one of the pieces of this, the last 3 days that had given me some hope, I think, because I really was expecting there to be a battle for Damascus, between some of these Syrian units. And I'm sure, as more information will come out, we'll get more indications that, military officials, pieces of the regime effectively understood that this was it was done and it wasn't even worth it, and probably reached out to these different opposition groups to sort of hasten the decline and protect themselves in the aftermath. I mean, you bring up the drug piece is a very interesting one, right? Because they were making Captagon. I've read estimates that had essentially drug income being equivalent to all of the rest of Syria's GDP in recent years. And it's so Captagon's like a party drug. It's an amphetamine. It's, I guess, called the poor man's cocaine. I mean, essentially, Assad had become the Adderall supplier to most
drug dealer. The Middle East,
the Middle East, right? But I think what that statement probably doesn't quite get right, which I'll just amend what I said, is a lot of the people and the groups involved in this were not under his control, really. They were, there are these very interesting stories that have come out about Syria really since about 2020, when there was kind of a national ceasefire. And a lot of the lines of control in the country were they date back to about then, is that you have these incidents of a lot of these militias, they need to raise money. And so they operate checkpoints to raise money on people who go through them. And the Assad regime, at some point in the past couple years, the actual specific year escapes me, had attempted to get rid of some of these checkpoints because, hey, they're supposed to ostensibly be the government, and you don't want there to be checkpoints in kind of regime-held territory, right? I mean, that is effectively lawlessness or warlordism. And when Assad tried to get rid of some of those checkpoints, there was a spate of bombings around them that many Syrians believe were actually conducted by a lot of these black market sort of traders and war profiteers, people running the checkpoints, because they didn't want to have their sources of income sort of removed. And so the Captagon trade is an interesting example of Assad effectively turning his state, and it always had elements of sort of mafia kind of, tactics. And you could look at the regime as a mafia prior to the war, and you were analytically on pretty solid ground. But it really became much more of a caricature, I would say, of a sort of mafioso clan in the years since. And it as a result, really ceded, I think, a lot of its sovereignty and power to a lot of really local groups, and it never got them back.
So, looking at it from the perspectives of MI6 in the UK, the CIA, I mean, they will be pleased to see the back of Assad. They were no friends of Assad, but they will be worried, won't they, about this group HTS, because it did come out years ago of a group which was affiliated to Al Qaeda, the terrorist group which was behind 9/11 and behind those terrorist attacks. And even though it's now changed, I mean, that is a big question, isn't it? And I can imagine that the security service in the UK, MI5, will be thinking, well, what are the potential implications of that? MI6 will be wanting to understand it. I imagine it will be the same in the CIA as well. And your kind of successors as analysts on Syria, that will be one of the kind of top things that policymakers are asking, aren't they? It's like, who are these guys and are they dangerous? Can we trust them? Can we work with them?
Yeah, I do not envy my analytical progeny at CIA, Gordon. They have.
I don't know what analytical progeny look like, but I've got an image of little baby McCloskeys. Anyway,
I've never met them in person either. They're in the skiffs at Langley.
That's the sensitive compartmented intelligence facility. Is that I got that right?
I believe it's information facility.
Information facility. Thank you for
yes.
That's where the secrets happen.
That's right. Also known as the vaults, which is where the workstations and safes and all of that are inside skiffs.
Inside
at
skiffs.
Langley.
So those are the people. Inside the skiffs. Then what are the Syria analysts kind of looking at? Do you think
the poor Syria analysts in the skiffs? I mean. So let's take the question of, sort of, I guess, interim government governance and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, being one of, but not the only kind of group or faction that needs to be considered in that equation. I mean, that is a massive question. There is another question, though, and probably more around, the United States has 900, I believe, soldiers in eastern Syria right now
doing counterterrorism work, aren't they? Yeah, against ISIS, the Islamic State group. Yeah,
right. And but through the sort of boots of a group called the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, which has sort of Arab components and Kurdish components, Kurds being one of the other ethnic groups in Syria. And there are all kinds of issues. We've seen, I think Donald Trump, President-elect Trump, went on Truth Social maybe over the weekend, I believe, and basically said this, the Americans, we're not going to have anything to do with Syria. This is not our problem. So there are these other dynamics around what happens out in the East if 900 US troops leave in February, as an example.
And let me just pick you up on that, because I think one of the things I know that UK counterterrorism officials worry about are the fact there are a lot of ISIS prisoners in camps which are run by SDF and those groups. And there's been long a fear that particularly, the Turks who've been backing HTS, want to go after the Kurds because they're longtime enemies. The Kurds are worried about being cut loose by the Americans. If the Americans withdraw, they're saying, well, we won't be able to guard these camps. And then the risk is, and I think that will be the real worry from the kind of counterterrorism professionals, is that then, there's less security around those camps. People get out, ISIS fighters, some of them hardened, dangerous fighters, as well as women and children, a kind of mixer in there, could get out, and that could pose a threat, a kind of counterterrorism threat. So I think there are worries about the fallout from this, aren't there?
No, absolutely. I mean, and there are Islamic State cells operating in central Syria and these kind of desert regions that the Assad regime, frankly, is purposely not targeted. I think, because they didn't want, resources were scarce, obviously, and they didn't quite have the military capacity, I'm sure, to do it effectively. And B, the existence of a sort of an Islamic State in Syria provided a kind of raison d'etre for the regime, as flawed, I think, as that logic is. So you've got the Islamic State and sort of, I guess what you'd call a problem of, will that presence grow under, either under a new government in Syria, or frankly, more likely, because the new government is unable to enforce its kind of writ throughout.
And there's a vacuum in which
the
they
country,
grow.
right?
Yeah.
And then there's the other related question, which you posed up front, around what do these different factions, HTS first and foremost, what do they really want? What kind of government will they install? And will it be a kind of, will there be room for, not necessarily in the government, but maybe, I guess maybe a wink and a nod or looking the other way. I think this would be the fear toward these kind of transnational global jihadist groups like the Islamic State, who, oftentimes have external attack plotting groups inside them who are trying to come up with new and creative ways to kill, Europeans and Turks and Americans, and so we're worried about that, right? I mean, I think
that's bound to be the top question, isn't it, for those those analysts? I mean, it's interesting as well because this issue of, because there's a lot of debate in the UK about, should we talk to this group because it's been prescribed as a terrorist organization, and can we work with them? Should we work with them? One of the things, if you go back and look at the history of these things, you see groups fall in and out of favor. I mean, and the state being willing or not to talk to them. I remember particularly Libya. There's a group called the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and there were years when actually Britain backed them secretly, even though they were a kind of jihadist group in the kind of 80s and 90s, because they were against Gaddafi and we were against Gaddafi, and they were a kind of Gaddafi opposition group who was ruling Libya. And then Gaddafi became our friend after 2003, and these guys were the enemy. And then Gaddafi became our enemy again after kind of 2011, and then they became, and then they became our friend, and then they became a threat to us and became our enemy again. You saw how actually, the British state and Western states sometimes can quite quickly move from considering some of these groups to be friends or enemies, depending on the circumstances, and and needs must. So I think we'll see, and I think a lot will depend on the leadership of HTS have kind of made the right noises that they want to be inclusive and involve other groups, and they're not going to be in any way kind of jihadist like the past. But I guess that's the question everyone's going to be watching, isn't it?
That is. I mean, I think that is one of the biggest questions about the future of Syria, that, again, those people locked in skiffs at Langley right now are trying to sort through is, what does Jolani, the head of HTS, what does he want?
What does he really believe? What does he really believe? Yeah.
It has been fascinating to kind of watch his progression over the past 15 years, because this is a guy who fought the US in Iraq, was imprisoned for a while at Abu Ghraib, was the sort of Syrian franchisee of the group that, I guess, created the Islamic State, then called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. He turns on them and joins forces with sort of Al-Qaeda Central. And then when Al-Qaeda Central tries to build a franchise in Syria, Jolani turns on that franchise and essentially destroys it militarily.
Yeah.
Maybe he's evolved. Maybe he's a chameleon. Maybe he's both. I think he's obviously politically very cunning. He's saying the right things right now about dealing with, minority groups in Syria. He's saying the right things about governance.
But saying the right things doesn't mean,
No. Now, but what we do have, though, is the 7 or 8 year track record of HTS running Idlib, this northwestern
and where
province,
they've been more pragmatic
from.
and more pragmatic rather than, if you like, totally jihadist, I suppose.
Yeah, they have a technocratic government in Idlib called the Syrian Salvation Government, but there are also plenty of instances where sort of the religious ideology comes to the fore. And I think it's very clear, at least to this point, that he is not a Jeffersonian Democrat. They do not believe in popular sovereignty. Minority groups are not represented inside the political structures in Idlib province. So there are a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Right, at this point.
But before we finish, I mean, I guess we should say a quick word about the geopolitics of it. I mean, it's hard not to see this as a blow to Iran and Russia, for whom Assad had been their ally. I mean, they propped him up. Clearly, at some point in the last, 10 days, they decided, the game was up. He wasn't worth expending any, more effort over. I mean, Iran obviously has been on the back foot because it's lost its proxy Hezbollah, or at least it's not lost it, but it's been done enormous damage by Israel, in the conflict there. Think about the pages and all those other attacks. And Hezbollah had been used by Syria to fight in its civil war by the Assad family to keep in power. And Russia has an interest with a naval base and an air base, but at some point, thought this guy's done. I mean, they cut and run, and that's it. And it is a blow to them, isn't it? I mean, they might be able to salvage something out of it, but it's hard to see it as anything else.
Yeah, I think for for both Russia and Iran, it does obviously seem like it's a massive geopolitical blow. Although I do think, if you look at the Russians, let's take them to start. I think this is a case where, the sort of old dictum about how there are, sort of enduring interests, not necessarily allies, right? The Russians are keen to maintain their naval facilities on the Syrian coast of Tartus, and which I believe they use the airfield on the coast and this naval facility are used to resupply Russia's efforts in Africa. Including
That's right. The airbase,
Wagner.
I think, especially is important for cargo flights going from Russia through to Africa. Yeah. So it's important.
It's important. And it's also possible that either these opposition or these sort of newly formed governing groups, whatever we want to call them, will just allow it to continue, will potentially extract a price from the Russians to allow it to continue, or may not be able to actually, enforce their writ along the coast. That's also a possibility kind of as you get going, that they may not fully control that territory. So the Russians might be able to keep a lot of what they, got from Assad under a new regime. I mean, it's certainly it's a shakier prospect at this point.
You wouldn't want to be predicting, would you, at this point? What's going to happen, because I think this is a kind of range of outcomes. And if some policymaker, if the president of the United States were to come to Mini McCloskey today and say, kind of what's going to happen, I mean, you'd have to go, we don't know. There's a range of outcomes, aren't there? And it would be hard to predict, I guess.
There's probably a scenarios piece, and when Assad began to totter in 2011. Me and some colleagues, we were the ones who wrote the sort of scenarios for Syria piece. And we came up with 4 of them, because the way you do these analytic scenario exercises, there's typically 4. And then we shaved it down to 3 to make it a little bit simpler to communicate. I guarantee you that piece has been updated and used a ton in those prior years, but also right now. I mean, there's probably a piece that an analyst wrote inside CA 2 or 3 years ago on that exact thing that they are dusting off right now and working on to write up in the PDB. So it's absolutely a question of scenarios at this point. Absolutely.
Well, I guess the one thing as we finish to say, it's in the hands of the Syrian people in a way no one thought it would be. And it's, they're the ones, as you said earlier, they're the ones who've been, instrumental in overthrowing this family, this regime, which has ruled over them, oppressed them for so long. And it's in their hands to some extent. I mean, there'll be geopolitical players trying to influence it, but it's in their hands to see what happens, isn't it? Yeah.
That's right. Well, and I think I would make one more just point on that, because I do think this, as our listeners consume media on this over the coming days and weeks, I just would really encourage everybody to really make an effort to not view this first through the lens of geopolitics. There's a time and a place for that. And it's, of course, valid to talk about all of these dynamics with respect to Russia and Iran and counterterrorism and all of that. But I think that there is time here to just take stock of the fact that it has been really the struggle of a lot of very ordinary Syrians and the sacrifice paid by so many Syrians to see this regime finally come down. And I would really encourage people to prioritize listening to those voices, in the coming days and weeks as we all try to make sense of this and what's coming.
Yeah, that's a great note on which to end. So, well, thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Just a reminder, we'll be back Wednesday, which is for our regular episode, and that will be the second half of our story of the CIA in Afghanistan in the extraordinary al-Qaeda prisoner revolt that led to the first death of a CIA officer in the country after 9/11. But thank you for listening to this emergency pod on Syria, and to the rest is classified.
Thanks for listening.